very much, Laura, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be in Barcelona again. I'm like very much your town. And yes, what I want to present to you is a chapter from the book Laura has just mentioned, but I will have to shorten it a little bit so that I don't bore you. And the issue is on the EU promotion of gender democracy, and it's a study where I compare EU politics before the Arab Spring and what they do now. So I'm not quite sure where you come from, migration studies, international relations. I don't know how much EU integration you have as a background, so perhaps I mention a few things. First of all, the EU defines itself as a community of values. What some people don't know, that the promotion of democracy and human rights is a legal part of EU foreign relations. You find this in the Lisbon Treaty. And what is gender democracy? It's the broadest concept. It's more than women's rights. We talk about gender democracy if equal participation in all different segments of life is actually put into practice. Economy, politics, society, education, access to health, simply everything. And so the key assumption is that if you talk about democracy, you have to include gender democracy or it is no democracy. So this is perhaps to start with. And coming to the Arab Spring, it was obvious that women were very active during the uprisings. I think you all remember, it was covered in the media. You could see how active women were in the streets in organizing these uprisings. But in the end, I mean, you all know that the results so far are not very promising, apart from Tunisia. You don't see these women very much anymore. So they were very prominent during the uprisings, but are sort of invisible now. Now, what role for the EU? How does the EU react to that? Because the EU has been active in the promotion of gender democracy before. So this lecture is not so much on the region, because there are other people who know much, much better, like, for example, Laura, and she might have to help me sometimes. I talk more on the EU. I want to know whether lessons have been learned or whether there are still lessons that should be learned. Very, very shortly, something on the theoretical background. Together with colleagues, we have developed an approach. It's not a real theory, it's a theoretical approach, mid-range. And we call it logics of action. And what we try to find out is if you have a historical juncture, like the Arab Spring, this usually triggers change, but we are skeptical how much change. And what we try to grasp is the quality of change. Is it really deep, fundamental political change, or is it just the adaptation of instruments to a new environment? This is what we are interested in. It's a constructivist approach. I don't know how acquainted you are with IR theories, and it draws on the assumption that structures and actors co-determinate each other. Alienational structures are norms and values. I told you the EU perceives itself as a community of norms, of values, belief systems, and paradigmatic discourses. And for the issue I talk about today, the patriarch, is this how you pronounce it in English, patriarch? Is one of the most decisive concepts that is internalized by people in many, many societies, not necessarily in a conscious way. It's like the background that people live, and women and men. And furthermore, what is decisive is the discursive construction of the West and the Islam as binary cultures. I don't know whether you heard about Edward Said othering. Can you put up your hands if you know this concept? So, okay, I will keep this low or else we get into a theoretical discussion. So I move on. Material structures, of course, is the legal settings. It's on United Nations level, CEDAW, the EU treaty, and of course the national laws in European member states, but also in the countries in the MENA region. The political settings, Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, European Neighborhood Policy and Union for the Mediterranean. Who knows about that? Put up your hands, please. Nobody, so I keep this low too. So perhaps I cut it very, very shortly. These material structures, the interdependency between the countries, economically, power politics, the legal settings, the EMP, ENP, and UFM is the institutional framework of Euromed relations. They have a lot of contracts, the EU with Mediterranean countries, and they are all put in political frameworks. You don't need to get into the details today. And the material structures, they impact on what preference, on the priorities on the political agenda, and how much room for maneuver there is for political actors. So talking about the agenda, the promotion of democracy, and this includes the promotion of gender democracy, is not a key issue in Euromed relations. It's a key issue for this night, for this lecture, but it ranks rather low in EU foreign policy in the region. Furthermore, it has not always been treated as a goal for itself, but it has been instrumentalized in the context of other, more important policy goals. And the top priority in Euromed relation from a European perspective is security and stability. This comes first, and all the rest comes second, third, and goes down. So now let's talk about the EU and the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring came suddenly for the Europeans. The EU was taken by surprise, and it was very embarrassing for the EU because it shed light on policy failure. The EU, in all the documents of this EMP, ENP, UFN, there's a lot of paper around these institutional frameworks, and there's a very, very strong normative rhetoric that all this was about spreading democracy, spreading values, including gender democracy, and this had not materialized. And as I said before, the real political goal of the Europeans was to get stability, security. And with the uprisings, this has not been accomplished either. So they had neither promoted democratic change, nor had they done anything to stabilize the region. Because what had happened in the Arab Spring had nothing to do with the EU. It was not sort of the EU helping civil society to get on the streets. The EU didn't know anything what's going on. They were surprised, and you might remember that the French government was thinking of how to help Ben Ali to crash down the uprisings in Tunisia while he was already packing his suitcase to leave the country. So the starting point, you can imagine, was very, very difficult because the EU has lost a lot of credibility in the region. So we don't go into the framework. As I said, the EU had been cooperating very, very densely with the authoritarian regimes. For the EU, it was about hard security, fighting terrorism, fighting organized crime, sort of fighting migration, as though migration was part of very vague concept, but that's the way it is, sort of a realpolitik approach. And this was the leading paradigm of the whole political activities. And the result you can see in a few pictures, embarrassing today. Here we are. This was before the Arab Spring, the Union for the Mediterranean ministerial meeting in 2008. So why did they do that? I mean, they have experts. Why did they stick to these guys? There are a few misperceptions that shape EU policies. One misperception was the idea that Arab autocracies are everlasting. There's a lot of talk about Arab-Muslim exceptionalism. You have democratic waves in all parts of the world, but not in the Arab world, and against the background that many of these regimes are really lasting for decades now. It's perhaps understandable, but in Brussels, they thought, well, you can't do much against them. They are so strong. We better accept them. Furthermore, there was little knowledge on societies, the idea that you have only two options. Either you side with these regimes, whether you like them or not, or you have to side with the Islamists. And if you don't like either one nor the other, it's still better to be with the regimes because they are predictable. You can rely on them, you know how they think, you know how they act, whereas with the political Islam, you don't know what they are up to, so it's better to stay with your old partners. At least they maintain stability. And there was the perception that there is nothing like civil society in the Arab world. And of course, when the Arab Spring started and civil society could be seen in the street, it was difficult. Based on these misperceptions, there was very dense cooperation between European governments and Arab governments in the stance or in the fight against political Islam to keep it down. So, and here we have EU promotion of gender democracy. As I said in all the documents in the beginning, also in the 90s, you had all this talk about promotion of democracy and human rights. And the Arab regimes did not like it anymore. They signed the contracts where you have all these wordings, but they made very clear that they are not happy about it, that they perceive it as intrusive, that as neo-colonial, the EU sort of trying to interfere in their domestic affairs. And especially after September 11, the terror attacks, when the EU changed its priorities again, or made it more clear that security, fight against terrorism has top priority, decided that it's perhaps not a good idea to provoke these regimes. Because they would say, Mubarak would say, Ben Ali would say, we are experts in the fight against Islamist terrorism. So if you want us to help you, if you want us to be a strong alliance against international terrorism, then please stop your democracy promotion agenda, because it might end up with elections and you do not know who the people will elect. You might end up with an Islamist regime in your neighborhood. So the EU became more and more holding back. And the programs and instruments for democracy promotion were becoming more and more unpolitical. It was more cultural exchange, heritage, all good things, but not really not questioning the regimes or the political systems of their neighbors. But there was one exception, and that was the promotion of women's rights groups, secular women's rights groups. They have an anti-Islamist outlook, and so it seemed to be a win-win situation. The EU could after having talked so much about norms and values and democracy promotion, could sort of prove, look, we help these movements, we support women's rights in the Arab world. The regimes could say, don't say that we are not ready for political reform. We promote political change in gender issues. We welcome women rights groups, and both were very happy about this anti-Islamist agenda. And so in many of the countries, in Egypt it was Suzanne Mubarak, the wife of the president. They had the so-called Suzanne laws, good laws, positive laws that really pushed the agenda in a progressive way so that the situation for women became better. And in Jordan it was princesses, and it was sort of high-ranking ladies, be it in the monarchies, from the family of the king or wife of the president, who were sort of chairing Women National Council or heading the Women National Council. And so, well, yes, in the beginning everybody was very happy about it, including me, because this is when I started my research. Now, this sounds very strategic. The EU policy is not that strategic all the time. It was also a new experience. The EU Commission was not experienced in cooperating with civil society. It was something new that came up in the 1990s, and they suddenly were told, now you have to do promotion of gender issues, women's rights issues, and so they had to identify partners. So they first asked groupings in Europe, do you have any contacts to Arab world? Do you know whom shall we address, how can we address? So it was sort of the natural partners that were already there. And it was easy to find them because many of these very active women have studied in France, and they speak French and English, and the application for programs that the EU publishes are in French and English. So one speaks the same language, really in the sense of language, but also the way of thinking, because many of these women have a European educational background. So what people in Brussels did not think about and did not realize that these secular women's rights groups are not very representative for their countries. They very often come from the upper class, and they have ideas that are not necessarily shared by a wide range of women in their country. And these were things that only people became aware of later. So what is important for me to make clear? There is nothing wrong with secular women rights groups. They did a great job, and they still do a great job. For me, it's problematic, this very strong anti-Islamist bias, but I think it's not me to tell them. It's their decision. Problematic is that an external donor like the EU excludes other groupings and has only this spectrum. I mean, the women's rights movement is much, much broader, and they have chosen one segment and didn't even know there is more. Not only that they ignored it, they simply had not much knowledge. And so this is why when the EU promoted gender democracy in the Arab world, they actually promoted the state feminism that was also exploited and instrumentalized in the political agenda of authoritarian regimes, so they could pretend that they are liberal, even though the work of these groups, there were clear limits. They could not question the regime. There were red lines, and they knew where the red lines are. And as long as they stayed within the red lines, they could do. They could be active, but they could not cross them. I forgot her name. There's one very famous women's rights activist in Tunisia. She crossed the red lines and she was tortured and she had to go. She spent a long time in prison and then made it to France. She only came back after the Arab Spring because she had ignored the red lines and wanted to do more than what is allowed within state feminism. So now the EU has a dilemma after the Arab Spring. How to go on after what has happened. She cannot suddenly drop her partners and say, state feminism was yesterday, we don't like it, we don't work together with you. They can't leave them in the lurch. But they can also not ignore that there is political Islam, and there had been an empowerment of political Islam in Egypt. We had 1 year a president from the Muslim Brotherhood and parliamentarians, female parliamentarians from the Muslim Brotherhood. And these were developments the EU had to sort of react to. They could not ignore it. They could not pretend not to know. So the EU had to learn how to cope with a situation that they did not really like. I mean, in Gaza in 2006, we had a case when the EU had promoted, in the framework of EU democracy promotion, the elections in Gaza. The monitoring of the elections were organized and financed with the support of the EU. And when the people in Gaza elected Hamas, the EU declared Hamas to be a terrorist organization and did not want to, respect the will of the Gaza voters. And this was sort of a Sündenfall in German. It was a case that people did not forget in the Arab world. The EU lost a lot of credibility after that. And it's very clear that they cannot do it again. If the people in Egypt elect Morsi, the EU cannot say we don't speak with him because we don't like the Islamists. The EU was...
Well, I think the Hamas organization also had to change a lot because of that. They now were observed by the whole world. They had to also cut some boundaries to some organizations they would probably like before.
This is true.
Perhaps also had to get more to the EU.
I think the problem is the incoherence. Yeah. One cannot, on the one side, say we want free elections. If you say we want free elections, then you have to accept the result. Or you say, well, for political reasons, we think it's better if they don't have elections now. Then you don't get into the into the situation. But supporting election, monitoring them, financing them, and then not accepting the result is so contradictory that the EU lost a lot of reputation, even by people who don't like Hamas. It's a matter of principle. To criticize this does not mean that you like Hamas. It simply means that EU policy must be coherent if they want to be credible. And so they very well know about the results of this Gaza election, and they know that they can't do it again and again, because now people are watching the EU. They talked so much about elections and democracy that they have to cope with Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood and accept that there are women also active, and they have not the faintest ideas what these women think and want and do. They were outside of their focus. So is gender democracy a matter of secularism? This is the question that people at least had to start thinking about. For many, perhaps most secular women's rights groups, definitely yes. I had been to conferences in Mersin in Turkey and to meetings, and for many of them, they feel for example, Egyptian women's rights groups, when mostly the Muslim Brotherhood won the elections, they said, well, we are the losers of the revolution we started. This is not what we wanted. And also in Tunisia, some of them are really fierce and say, well, if this is democracy, we'd rather go without democracy. As long as just keep these Islamists away, because they, for us, are much more problematic than an authoritarian regime where we know the rules of the game and where we have some impact, can widen our room for maneuver at least a little bit. For us, it's better. So you have these voices. But then the idea that patriarchal structures is something Muslim, I would say no, because you find it in all segments of society. You find it in secular and religious segments, and you find it among Muslims, Copts, Catholic, and Protestants. And this became so clear to me because I did a very similar research in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall. You know, then there was an accession process of Eastern European countries to the EU, and Germany was unified. And then the Eastern European countries, they have to accept the acquis communautaire, they call it. They have to become a member of the EU, you have to accept and respect all the laws, all the treaties that the EU has already decided on before. So this includes gender issues, women's rights, gender equality, gender mainstreaming as an instrument. And so there was discourse on gender relations in the East. And then it was very much the same. It was not the Muslim who is sort of backwards, then it were the Easterners that are backwards. From a Western perspective, they had to learn. And they also had state feminism. So many women's rights groups in the East didn't like the notion feminism. For them they did not like the word, the concept. And the discourse about what is a feminist, what is gender democracy, who understands what, was very, very similar to what we now have in IEMed relations. And even among civil society, it's sort of an approach that are sort of looking down, top down. The Europeans know, the West know, and the others have to learn. And these secular women's rights groups, they come closest, they are like us, they deliver our ideas, and the rest is waiting for us to help them. We come and we reach out for them, and we teach them, and we educate them, and in the end, they are like we are. Because we are, in our country it's good, and in your country it's not good. And this discourse is not very helpful, and also it's not realistic, because also, at least I can speak of Germany, we have lots of gender problems. If you look how many, the pay gap, what women earn, what men earn, who is doing the career, who is not doing the career, Germany is far away from having solved all gender problems. But there is this attitude, and this attitude is not very helpful. So, is there Islamist feminism? There are religious groupings, women who talk about Islamist feminism. For some secular groups, it's a contradiction in terms. But you have also Menassi, she's called, I think, a professor. She has reinterpreted Quran, and you have they say that the patriarchal bias of Quran interpretation is only as it is because it's men who do the interpretation. You can read it differently. By the way, we had the same discourse in Protestant church, and women who reinterpreted the Bible so that you can understand the stories in a different way if you look from a different angle. So you have very different discussions on that, and it's a very religious discourse, how to understand these texts. But these concepts are, among people, perceived as closer to their own identity. It's not Western, but it's Arab Muslim, so the legitimacy is perhaps higher. If you look on their writings, you can see that there is common ground. Although they might have very little contact, many ideas they share. Political rights, economic rights, and especially equal access to education and health systems for girls and boys. These are basic issues, and fight against violence, stop violence against women is also a common issue. But there are other issues where you find no common grounds, for example, sexual self-determination, sexual rights. These are issues where I did not hear that there is much things in common. I myself do not speak and so do not read Arabic. I can only take it from the literature of people who studied that. I'm not an expert on that. I cannot follow all these discourses. But I realize that there are many debates, discussions, discourses. It's not one Western secular feminism and another Arab Muslim feminism and nothing in between. There are many shades and different concepts, and they are not static. They change. And so, yes, there are dividing lines, difficult to overcome, but yes, there's also common ground where one could build on. How much time do I have? I have time. So dividing lines that are not very often discussed and that I perceive as rather strong is class and education, that gender issues, women's rights activities is a middle upper class issue. You don't find it, so you find it more in the big cities and not so much in the rural parts of the country. It's still a minority of women who are really dealing with these things or becoming active. And I don't see, from what I learned in my research, there is not much activity to really spread it. It's a very, and so the women's rights movement is strong, but it's rather narrow. And I think it's not only about religion versus secularism. I think a big issue is about classes and of society, who's included and who is excluded. Now, what can the EU do? It can do what it did before: stick to their traditional partners. They can open up to Islamist women, or they refrain from supporting specific groupings and rather introduce gender mainstreaming as a benchmark. More for more concept is a new concept in the regional policy. The more the partner countries are ready to do political reform, the more support they get. And a benchmark to measure whether they succeed in political reform could be gender issues in this program. So what would happen if the EU took the first option? It could be perceived as neocolonial, that they only support those that are sort of like-minded, that are as almost European, and as though the end goal is if they all are like Europeans, then it's okay. Then the mission is accomplished if the whole IEMed region is European. And also it's difficult because if you have, in a country, let's take Tunisia as an example, at the moment they have power struggles. different groupings, ideologies, ideas, struggling for power in society, in the political system. And these power struggles, that is the essence of democracy. But if you support with financial support, capacity building, etc., only one segment, you interfere in this power struggle. Because then it's an external empowerment that does not necessarily represent the will of the people. If one grouping has strong external support and the others have not, and of course we don't know whether they have no support. Most likely they also have external support. But is it really helpful if external countries, actors, interfere so much in domestic power struggles by throwing money at those groupings that they like? Is this really helpful in a process of political transition? Open up to Islamist women. Very difficult because there's still a lack of knowledge. Who knows them? Who are they? Many of these women are not necessarily interested in getting into contact with EU because the EU had sort of presented them as either the enemy or the victim that needs to be freed by Europeans. It's both not very nice. They did not get any support from the EU so far, although they had suffered from repression in their countries, and the EU that talks so much about human rights did not talk about them, and now they suddenly come and say, oh, shall we talk and shall we help you? And so it's a lack of credibility, a lack of trust. And then there's a lack of political will within the EU, because one thing is lessons learned. You can make an analysis of what happened and say we have to change politics now. It was wrong to ignore political Islam. Now we open up to political Islam. I will illustrate this with an anecdote. I went to Berlin. I was invited to the foreign ministry, and there was a, how do you call it, when you stand around and drink coffee and wine? There was some meeting, and afterwards you stand around and you, well, it wasn't really a party. You stand around and you talk. And two guys from the foreign ministry, I could hear them talk, but they did not realize that I heard them talk. And they thought it's between them, and they were complaining that they now have to meet all these Islamists. It was during the Morsi year in power, and they were completely fed up. Ugh, them again. They simply didn't like them. They are different. They have different ideas. And they were not really willing to exchange. It was just that they had the order, top down, you have to meet them, you have to do dialogue with them. And they did it, they invited them, and they came, but they didn't like them, and they were happy when they were out again. And on this basis, it's very difficult to get anywhere. If in the end, if you're honest, you don't like each other. And this is what I call, in my logics of action terminology, ideationist structures. In their logics of action, the Islamist is still the enemy, or at least the one I don't like, the other, the stranger, the one who is different, and the one we don't like. And this is very, very deep and very difficult to overcome, because this shaped policy making for decades. And now suddenly the people are asked to open up and become tolerant and to do dialogue, and it's difficult. Promote gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is a Western concept. Do you know what gender mainstreaming means? So this becomes too complicated. Now, it's interesting that you don't know, because my students, who are all soldiers, and 90% men. They don't know, and I always think they don't know because they are men and soldiers. So obviously it's a very EU thing that they have concepts and think everybody knows about them. Gender mainstreaming is European law, should be put into practice also in Spain. It basically means that in every policy field, before you decide something, you have to think about the impact on both gender, female and male, and make sure that it's not to the disadvantage of either the man or the woman. This is the idea, and it's law, and there are many, many instruments how to put it into practice, and it doesn't work very well. The EU had to introduce it in Eastern Europe, and it didn't work. And it didn't really work because even the EU officials who have to implement it don't like it very much. Too feminist, it's not a Muslim exceptionalism not to be very fond of progressive feminist politics. The average EU state official or who has to implement these programs is not necessarily a proactive feminist. He does what he has to do, but it ranks low. And if he gets around it, he will try to get around it and just do it on paper. So I don't see the EU as a gender mainstreaming promoter in the Arab world. And perhaps it's okay because this would surely be perceived as very Western, because it is a Western. It's an instrument that was developed in Europe. It's a very European context. So what the EU did, realizing that they have little knowledge and that they are confronted with a very difficult situation and don't really know how to cope with it, they asked researchers to do background research. And for example, the EP, there was a study paid by the EP on women's rights during democratic transition in 2012 with regard to the Arab Spring, and I had the honor to participate in this group of researchers. And the main results were, as policy advice, follow and respect the diversity of gender discourses in the region, look for common ground in these discourses, define benchmarks that refer to their discourses, not gender mainstreaming, but listen what these groupings agree on and then promote that, and distinguish between countries. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach where developments are so different. So what are the new initiatives? There is a program called Spring Forward for Women, and there was a ministerial conference on the Union for the Mediterranean on strengthening the role of women in society in 2013, and I just learned that next week there will be next one in Barcelona. And the national action plans between the EU and its partner countries, women's rights, at least on paper, rank high, and there are many small EU-funded projects. The priorities is economic empowerment of women, political empowerment of women, and violence against women, how to stop it. And the strategies is very much focused on education and capacity building, especially in the economic level, how to help startups, and awareness rising in whole society, then including especially men, on gender issues. Now, to evaluate them, it's far too early, because what really matters is the process of implementation. I mean, the paperwork has always been good. The EU is very good in producing paper, but we have to wait and see. The problems are not mentioned in the papers. There is no discussion on secularism and religion, but it wasn't before. This has never been expressed. It was never, people did not talk about it. You can exclude people without mentioning them. You simply don't, you just don't mention them and don't invite them. And So it's still not in the text, and which is perhaps good, because I wouldn't know how to put it. To see whether programs are inclusive or exclusive, one has to evaluate them once they have been implemented, and this is too early. What is very interesting is the role of the EU delegations. The delegations are sort of embassies of the EU in all the partner countries, and they are the ones who have it's their job to identify if the EU wants to promote civil society and partner NGOs, people they can work together with. And so far, they never had Islamist or religious groupings on their agenda. And the question is whether they, because, I mean, they are at least in the country and not far away in Brussels, whether they start to follow discourses, gender discourses, in the whole society, not only in the secular segments of the people they know anyway. This has a lot to do with what kind of staff. Are there enough women in the delegation? And the women working in the delegations, are they educated about gender issues? Are they aware of the whole problematic? We all know that the Arab Spring was also a conflict between generations. So it would be very important to address young people. So in the EU delegations, you would need at least a minimum of young women with the language knowledge and that are educated about Muslim society to be able to get into contact with these other groupings. And this is something that could be, research-wise, could be studied very easily, just to find out who works in the delegations. Because if it's old men's club, forget about it. You won't get anywhere. Not necessarily because old men are not aware of the problem. It's the matter, how do they get into contact? How do they become, can they become partners? And so this is interesting to see. And then I would like to know whether what are the benchmarks? Is it gender mainstreaming or is it different concepts? And I mean, putting benchmarks on paper is one thing, implementing them. Is it really a criteria to decide whether you cooperate more or less with the country? Or is it just on paper? All this, it's far too early. I simply don't know how things go. The worst case scenario would be that the EU comes to term with the newly evolving regimes, be they Islamist and or military or whatsoever, and make women's rights and gender equality a compromise item, something that you can, if you have negotiations, that you can shift around however it's useful to get your high policy interests through. And this strategy could be framed as culturally sensitive. If you, for example, if the EU has to deal with Morsi and he does not like too much of this gender stuff, then you could sort of lean back and say, we have to respect the Islamist president and we better drop it. Then women's rights movements, the secular groupings in the forefront would really be the losers of the revolution. If this strategy comes through, then it's true that they would have lost their battle. This could happen. Why? The Arab Spring is a historical juncture, but no 0 hour. There's a lot of persistence, even though there's a lot of change. On both sides, we have a restoration in Egypt, very much persistence, but we also have persistence in European politics because the structures are resilient. We still have the security paradigm, and I mean with civil war in Syria, failing state in Libya, the new IS, new quality of terrorism, I think it's quite understandable that security ranks high. You also have the resilient perception on Islam. That's what I just tried to illustrate with the anecdote. You can decide that one should open up and be more open, but it's very difficult to really fundamentally change your beliefs and your ideas what it's like. And this limits the capability of political learning. And you have the material structures. First of all, you have other competing states that also interfere and make their influence felt. You have elected governments in the MENA who don't want this political reform agenda of the EU, and within you, external actors who also offer money and support, they don't have to bother about the EU. They can go without the EU. You have civil war and state failure, and you have a financial crisis in Europe. Europe has a lot of problems with Greece and, well, financial crisis also in Spain, that many people think this should be the priority and not the Arab world that is a big chaos anyway. And so this limits the room for maneuver if you have something so specific as the promotion of gender democracy. What a small issue if you think it all the problems, and still I would say it's part and parcel of democracy. So the conclusion, if you look at the other policy fields, no substantial change in Euro-Mediterranean politics can be seen so far due to the resilient logics of actions. It's quite likely that gender democracy remains rather low on the policy agenda. Even if the EU wanted to change its approach, the room for maneuver is confined because the political situation is so extremely difficult at the moment. So my hope is not so much on the EU as an external actor, but rather on civil society within the region, the vision of a strong, inclusive, transnational women's rights movement. And okay, thank you very much for your patience and your attention.